Aloha mai kako and Iran karapte. Welcome to the very first live stream ever produced by Ancestral Connections. Ancestral Connections is actually a nonprofit dedicated to de-imperialized and anti-racist education. And it is my greatest honor today to present to you Takuan Amaru, who is an author of Gaikokujin, which is a trilogy of books that address the Japanese social code, as well as Black wellness and mental health in the Japanese context. And we're going to also be discussing his latest book, 21st Century Japan Decoded. So I would like to bring Takuan Amaru up on screen right now, and we are going to get right into this. I'm super
All right.
excited. Takuan and I have had probably over the last 2 or 3 years since before the COVID era, a lot of conversations about Japan, Japanese culture, the Japanese social code. And because Ancestral Connections tries to look critically around anti-racist anything, and in particularly uh, uh, Japan, and Japanese people, whether it be Japanese nationals or the Japanese diaspora, from a de-imperialized context. I really wanted to make sure that our audience was introduced to Takuan Amaru because a lot of what he has shared has been healing for me, in particular, as a woman who is mixed race, and with this heritage and connection to Japan. So, Takuan, we're going to jump right into it. I know our
Okay.
audience is excited to hear about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Oh, okay. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and very pleased. For myself, my mother is Japanese. My father is Native American, Native Black American, I should say. There's been a lot of talk about just this African American term, so I try to really stick with the Native and the Black to delineate myself. But yeah, my family really, I guess you could say, started in Japan, kind of like Naomi Osaka, and migrated to the United States. So I have a lot of experience of just or memories of just when I first arrived to the States, coming from a different culture, and especially coming off the military base too. And I talk about that in the first book, the first three books, as you mentioned, Guy Coaching the Story. But this book we're talking about today, 21st Century Japan Decoded, yeah, this is a nonfiction book. And it's really going into the nuts and bolts of Japanese society because I got a lot of emails throughout the years from people who live in Japan, or I should say non-Japanese people who live in Japan or people interested in coming. And they asked me about a lot of things, mainly like, are Japanese people racist? That was a big one. And but over the years, I finally just accumulated all of them and just decided to. First, I wrote a blog series, and then I took all of those and came up with 21st Century Japan Decoded.
Thank you so much for being so transparent about your history and your experiences. And like I said, for myself, and just I think, as you and I have talked as friends kind of over the years, and you've seen my posts in social media,
Mhm.
um, the Japanese experience has been one that, growing up for me, being multiracial, has been painful for me. I mean, I've had family call me Konketsujin. I've had family call me Ainoko. And I remember one time I had posted on Facebook that I would never raise my children in
Yeah.
in in Japan. But Takuan actually had responded during that time. There was a lot of police shootings where African Americans were being murdered. And I had posted something, and you had actually commented to kind of educate me a little bit that that wasn't happening in Japan, and that Japan was a place that has historically been, at least to the level of that type of violence on African American bodies, has not escalated to that point. And that really got me thinking about that. And you've also introduced me to a lot of as a at a you've introduced me to a pathway to engage with my history and my culture in a way that is not
Beautiful.
painful for me. So I would like for the audience to hear from you. Like, what draws you to the Japanese culture? What do you, this is your heritage as well, but what
Right.
do you love about this culture and this heritage of yours?
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. Well, I would say, especially for any Black person coming to Japan, it's almost impossible to not just be enamored when you first arrive, just because you don't get harassed by police. You don't have people like the people looking at you are, just Japanese people, but just that frame of mind when you see police cars come by, which you don't see very often, you don't get this traumatic feeling. That along with the stability and the infrastructure. I think there's a person called, I think, Mrs. Eats or something. She posted a video and she has a breakdown on when foreigners come to Japan, and she calls the first phase the honeymoon phase.
Mm-hmm.
And during that phase, yeah, like, wow, look at this sushi I never saw before, or this, and that's normal. So just the stability and safety from a physical standpoint. Yeah, Japan, for dark skinned people is, can't beat it.
And I just wanted to put that out there because what we're doing today, we're not going to be Japan bashing.
Right.
And I know that that is a big concern with Japanese Americans, given the anti-Asian, the Asian hate climate of this country, right? We're not going to be Japan bashing, but we are going to be looking at Japan through a very critical lens and
Right.
through a historical context, so we can talk about the sociology of Japan that has made it very painful for people like myself and others to really engage in this culture. So
Right.
let's get down to it. Explain to us the historical context of the Yamato Code. What is it?
Okay. Yeah. Could you bring up that? Yep. Well, Yamato is a historical name, an ancient name actually of Japan, and it actually also refers to a period in Japan, right? But basically, the Yamato Japanese people think that Japanese are like a homogeneous race, but that's not in fact true. And
Hmm.
Dr. Hayashi can really school you on that a lot better than I can. But anyway, but the main clan, you could say, was the Yamato, and they're the ones that pretty much, and you can even see on the map, they're pushing like the Imishi, which and the Ainu, which occupied the entire Honshu island, and really just took over. So this is kind of a coined expression that I'm using just to explain an abstract idea that really is difficult to just explain. But the Yamato Code, as I see it, is the code of ethics that Japanese society is run on. It's the actual foundation. And when you understand how each and every Japanese citizen has been, you could say, programmed, taught, you can choose your word, to behave in a very strict manner, it becomes, I don't want to say easy because it's still challenging, but it almost becomes fun even, um, because now you're able to navigate. You have a map, and like the questions I used to get, like, why do Japanese, do this, or why do they do that? Like, why is everyone so cold to me during certain times, and then they're really warm during other times, and this, and that, I'm like, okay, let me just try to explain it. So I just started looking into, first I went on the Japanese side of it, and because I figured I was going to have to do a lot of translating and stuff like that. But then I realized, no, usually when people objectively analyze something, it's always somebody from the outside. So of course, when you go into Western documents, boom, there it was. And there's just a very, very good way of looking at it is the way I put it, because you can see that most of these ethics that are listed, you can even find inside of Japanese classrooms when you walk in. And it's stuff like, simple stuff like study, right? Study hard, work hard, um, make sure you stay on code. You're very, very nice to the people in your group. It's like things that you really think about is normal,
Yeah.
um, like loyalty, duty, integrity, personal courage. These are the main ones. And if you're in Japan and a Japanese person comes against you and you know that you're in the right, by knowing exactly how the code states it, that's kind of how you get out of it. You never, because you can't snap at somebody. You can't, hey, especially somebody that's above your station. So what you do is you just alert everyone, hey, this is a violation of the code. And once that happens, the society will correct it. Like that's where their adage with the nail
Right.
sticking up. And
Right.
then, yeah, anybody can be the nail sticking up. Of
Right.
course,
So you're referring to that metaphor. I don't know how to say it in Japanese because I don't speak Japanese quite as well as you do, but it's something along the lines of I've heard it my whole life. The nail
mhm,
that sticks up gets
right,
pounded down. And many
right.
times in my life, I was that nail sticking up. And socially, I got pounded down by my peers or my elders. And so I kind of want to talk about this context a little bit more because when we're talking about though you've authored books about the Black experience, the foreign experience, Black mental health in Japan, somebody who is of Japanese heritage but diaspora coming to Japan, you are automatically that nail sticking up.
No doubt.
And for I think until I met you, I always kind of walked around with this deep hurt that I was the outsider, right?
Yes. Hmm.
And I did because I didn't understand the Yamato code. And
Right.
what you do in your books that I think is so brilliant is that you really do teach everybody, although I know that your main focus and passion is making this transition easier for those for Black folks, right? But really I think any foreigner, even of Japanese heritage, could benefit from this knowledge, and you really put into words the things that I've experienced my whole life that I had no words for. I didn't even know that it
Oh,
was a thing. um so thank you so much for that. You also in your book you talk about the Japanese complex, and you
right.
talk about the Japanese complex in relation to World War II. So can you get into that a little bit more
Yes.
for the
Mhm.
audience?
Okay. And actually, I allude to it that it probably even started when Commodore Perry first just invaded Japan because that's when they had the Sakoku edicts that was, excluding Europeans from coming into Japan.
Oh,
Um, but the Meiji era is kind of even all that because that's when all the Western influence started pouring into Japan. But it really, really, yeah, it really, really comes out after the atrocious atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just the entire humiliating way that Japan lost the war because Japan was locked down for 7 years or 6+ years, and Commodore Perry and his SCAP forces occupied the island. Nobody could go in or out. And I mean, just if you just think about it psychologically, you're not only are you conquered, these were, Japanese were very pride, very are very prideful people, and they were like, the evil devils, the gaijin, and then all of a sudden they just get trounced on, and all those people dying and all the fallout. Nobody knew what was going on, and they had to be forced. They were force fed Western ideas, particularly American ideas. The language, became compulsory in school. That you had to study the language of, like, 2 months ago it was the enemy's language, and now you have to, right? So there's going to be some kind of psychological fallout from that, and that's exactly what a complex is, right?
right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
you know
And I don't think and it could be the Yamato code, I don't know, but there is something within our society, at least in the diasporic context for Japanese, that we don't really acknowledge the trauma of the war
right,
and
yeah.
how that
Mhm.
has impacted our society and the way that we interact with each other. And really, you're one of the first authors that I know of that that is has gone into great detail around that. So I always found that really really interesting. You also say something in this book that my Japanese father told me to prepare me to deal with those that are Japanese nationals. And I never understood what he was telling me when he told me this. And I always thought it
Okay.
was like a put down thing. But there is actual some there's you explain in depth in your book that there's actual some cultural uh grounding in this, or at least societal grounding in this in Japan. So my father used to tell me, the world says that Japanese are the politest people that there are, but the Japanese people are two-faced, right? So can you and you say that like almost exactly. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like where does that come from?
Okay, well, first of all, yeah, that two-faced thing. My mother used to say it, and I write this in the book, and it really confused me as a child because whenever we visited Japanese people's homes, yeah, she would really get on me and say, "Listen," because I used to eat a lot. I was always hungry as a boy growing up, as a lot of healthy boys are, and she would tell me, "Listen, if they offer you something to eat, you have to decline." And I'm like, but I'm hungry, I don't care if you're hungry. And she's like, she made me have to wait. I couldn't say yes until they asked me 3 times. And she would say that is the only way you know if they're sincere in their desire to want to feed you. But as a boy, you think people always giving you stuff, right? But she never explained it. She never really explained it to me. It wasn't until I came here as an adult and really started decoding this. It's like tatemae, right? And the tatemae, a lot of people are, whether, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's just talking about the socially acceptable way of behavior, and
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
very, very strong in Japan. And
And this is crazy because I always thought this was just my family. So
right,
when I read your book, I was like, wow, because we don't think that as Japanese Americans
right.
that we have been influenced by this social code.
Hmm.
But reading it, it was almost like a blueprint to the way that my grandmother and grandfather thought. Like if you went to the picnic, in Japan they call it nigiri. In Hawaii we use more chugoku, so
Okay,
musubi. If you went
okay.
to if you went to a picnic or whatever, and or a dinner at another family's house, and you were the first to go and grab something to eat, oh, shame. Like that was big shame. Like you weren't raised right. So
Yeah, yeah.
so yeah. So it
And
was, yeah.
another one, when I was a teacher, there's one like the Kyoto sensei, the vice principal, always sits at the end of the room so he can survey everyone's desks who are this way. He's looking at them. He can see everyone. And when his desk is always going to be away from the door, right? Because that's another one of the samurai codes. Whoever is the most valuable person is always away from the door. Like you know, that's another story. But anyway, at the end of the day, everybody is wanting to leave, and you'll see people cleaning up and doing all kinds of things, and they look busy. But as soon as he walks past, 5 minutes later, everyone's gone, and it's just a tatemae thing. You cannot leave before him, or it's numbered. You better not do it too many times. You have an emergency here or there. But I just like seeing these things. Like, wait a minute, what's going on? You know, yeah, tatemae is very strong in Japan.
So is it fair to say then, when we're talking about we'll go back to that term you use, the Japanese social code, and you write extensively about this and this whole metaphor about the nail that sticks up and gets pounded down, right? So when foreigners, and I'm going to include myself and others of Japanese heritage that were not raised in
Right,
Japan, we were raised in another culture.
right.
When we go to Japan or when we enter into Japanese spaces, um would you say then it's fair to say that that is when the social correction happens?
Oh, if you come into Japan, not as a visitor, right? If you're a visitor, you get a totally different type of treatment. But once the Japanese understand, oh, you live here, right? Yeah, they start training you. What they perceive to be is training you, and it's subconscious in many ways. Another thing you have to remember, though, it's almost you can't really be too critical, or myself, I can't, knowing what I know, because in many ways they're trying to tell you. this is what you're going to need. These are the weapons you have to start perfecting and cultivating this in your personality right now if you're going to survive here, right? Especially if you are in their group,
Right.
right? Because really everything in Japan is group oriented. So you might see 100 Japanese outside somewhere, but usually if you start examining closer, you'll see it's just a bunch of smaller groups of 4 or 5 people, but they all can just coexist and play on the same place, because they all observe this code. Everybody knows, even if we don't speak to each other, we're communicating in a almost ethereal way, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah, and it's very strong. And the ability to do that or not do that is being Japanese, and how you're going to be treated. Any violation, anything you do that's kind of off code, and everybody's like, oh, he hasn't been trained, and that is moving away from being Japanese. Because as you know, like as you said, like you felt a sort of alienation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And that's definitely true. But Japanese people themselves feel alienated too, right? That's what the high suicide rate is about. Why?
Yes.
Because the ijime thing, right? Because why? That's the person who's not on code the most.
Yes, yes. So I
Mhm.
just fascinating. To me, your work has been very healing for me because
Oh,
all
beautiful.
my life I really felt like it was my racial mixture. I've been told by Japanese folks not really understanding what they're saying when they say that I'm not Japanese. And so my model being also being part Kanaka Maoli and from Hawaii was that no, this is my heritage, this is my genealogy,
Right.
right? And I think now there's a broader conversation about Japan diversity and Japan as a nationality. And now you're kind of bringing into the mix Japan as Japanese as a society, and like you're saying, the Japanese complex, right?
Yes.
So
Good.
I think that I really wanted our audience to kind of hear some of this background because it helps you to engage, I think, in um with Japan with less friction.
Okay.
But I would also dare say that in the diasporic context, a lot of us have internalized this, the Yamato code and these things. And so that to an extent does happen where there's a high concentration of Japanese people, even in the diasporic context. Um, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about maybe the history. I've been called some things that aren't nice by
Yeah.
Japanese language speakers, and I'm going to ask you to maybe talk about um, the history of these words, what they mean, and maybe like you just offer, how to maybe think about it when these words are coming at you. So I've been called hafu, and your Japanese is much better than mine. Please feel free to correct me.
No, no, it's fine.
Um,
Yeah.
I've been called konketsujin. I've been called ainoko, and this always bogs like to me. Konketsujin and ainoko is almost like a, for me, I've internalized it like a war reference. Like my parents had no legitimate relationship with each other, and that very hurtful for me. And then gaijin, right? And that always kind of boggles my mind. I'm like, what you talking about? Look at my eyes, right? Look at my last name.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so can you talk a little bit about, how those of us that are that these labels might be thrown at us, what we should be thinking about or what we could be thinking about?
Okay. I think the situation you may face in Hawaii is a lot different than in Japan,
Mm-hmm,
regarding
mm-hmm,
those terms, because konketsujin or you said ainoko,
mm-hmm,
right? If you look at the kanji breakdown of them, they tell you exactly what they mean, right? I
mm-hmm,
think ainoko, like the I is like the time, like kan, like the a time, like I don't even know how to say it, but like if you say like ijiji kan, the kan is the same thing, right? So it's saying you're in between, uh a human and not. They won't say
mm.
human, but that's,
Yeah.
because, oh, but another thing you have to remember, and this is not uh something that is only Japan, right?
Mhm.
Every culture sees themselves as the center, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
whatever their, their references, their mythology, and everything is going to come starting with them. So Japanese are no different. They're just fanatical about it to some degrees, right? You
Yes,
know,
yes.
right? Because of their island status, they're feeling they're going to be always attacked and all this, throughout history.
Right.
Um,
So some of this, it was my understanding that the Konketsujin and the Ainoko was coming from this idea that I was lesser because I wasn't pure Japanese and
yeah,
because my mother has African heritage.
right.
But I've heard different things that these are some is that these are racial slurs and some it was part of a World War II thing when your parents are not uh s- together or married. So I don't so sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you.
No,
Please
no,
keep
no.
explaining.
Okay, no, yeah, you're definitely on point. These are all pejoratives, and yeah, yeah, they were a way to designate because everything is designated in Japan. It's no different than the Burakumin, right, or even the Korean nationals who come over
Mhm.
here, right?
Mhm.
Zainichi, they have all kind of names for these people, and it's to say you're not the real thing here,
Mhm.
and they're all pejoratives. But the only one that really exists that you hear a lot anymore is gaijin of the ones you talked about. And there's another one, Kurombo. That is the straight N word for dark skinned people, right?
Mm.
Yeah. So that used to go on really bad in Okinawa. But Gaijin, right, is still very popular. People will slide it in. They'll even call you Gaijin san sometimes. And like Gaijin is like barbarian, basically, right? But it's the one that kind of slipped through. And even in the book, I talk about the difference between Gaijin and Gaikokujin, right? That happens to be the name of my fictional novel, but it's a different word altogether. Here, I'm talking about the actual word Gaikokujin, which is the official word for foreigner, you could say. But when you or here in Japan on the ground, you start to see there's certain people, especially the ones of Asian descent from China or Korea, who can blend in more visually. But there, if you the more you follow the code, you get more responsibility. You get a different type of respect that's not afforded to the gaijin off the boat who just wants to do everything in English and wants to do it my way and whatever they're doing. And
Mhm.
I'm not
Mhm.
saying I'm not trying to throw shade on that, but I'm just saying, but there needs to be some sort of designation so we can understand it to even talk
Yes.
about it, right?
Yes. Yes.
Hmm.
Which I really appreciate. And I thought it was important to kind of go over just some of the context of like what those words mean, when it's used, why it's used. And I'm not going to say that it's all social code and roses, right? Japanese, like any other people in the world, they're capable of being prejudiced, they're capable of being
Right,
bigoted. um, but at the same time, I just thought that it was important to like really kind of again just examine like those words and what now you might hear in Japan as being socially acceptable. So the gaijin and hakujin, is that correct? That's kind of thrown around
right,
more loosely.
right,
So, and which is again for me always blew my mind because I was thinking like, oh, what are you talking about? Genetics, my last name, right? And so in the book you use a word uchisoto.
hmm,
And so it's this idea of like insider, outsider, and to most of, I would say, the US, probably they would probably be perceived with a Japanese last name that I would be an insider in Japan, but I'm definitely not. And
hmm.
even in diasporic spaces for Japanese Americans, I'm definitely not insider. Can you talk a little? What is Uchi Soto, and is it better to be an insider or outsider?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Great question. And again, this is one of the foundational principles in the code, right, of just the society. So again, as I stated earlier, uh, Japanese are very group oriented. They call it dantai teki, right? They're very, very group oriented. So whether you're in a school, a company, whatever, you have to be in groups. And even when you do extracurricular activities, they end up making this strict group, and it's always kind of on military principles, right? What kind of adhesive to the, or being cohesive to the group, and morale and these kinds of things. Anyway, inside the group, you have to follow this code. And if you don't, you'll get put outside. And if you look at the history of Japan, when they had the feudal nations or clans and everything like that, each one had eta, right? Eta, which now are the Burakumi.
Mm-hmm.
And these people were mixed blood, and I think they were mixed with Ainu, or a lot of them were, and yeah, they were not allowed to be inside the city, and they were the ones who did all the work with the blood cutting and the butchering and stuff like that, making
Mm-hmm.
leather products. And anyways, but this mentality persists and exists today. And as you say, which one is better, to be inside or outside? Well, from a Japanese frame of mind, there is no choice, because to be outside is to be cast into a state of, you could say, social purgatory. And when you see this, links to the high suicide rate, and this links to the the hikikomori. Man, I'm having
Yes.
difficulty pulling these words up. And these are the social hermits who shack up in their parents' homes, and they refuse to deal with society. And so you're like, well, what's going on? There's no crime. People aren't robbing you. There's no murder. So the danger, you could say, if we're going to call it that, it's not so much in a physical way, right? It comes at you in this spiritual, emotional way. And if you
Yeah.
don't understand, if you don't get the shield for that, you could be a big buffed guy and all of that stuff, but you're not going to have anything for this, because it just comes from so many different directions.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Along the lines, we have a question, and the question is,
Okay,
does
great.
spirituality override any of the need to highlight purity of identity? I'll repeat. Does spirituality override any of the needs to highlight purity of identity?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to shout out the Soulful Chicago Book Fair, and Sister Asada Kirkland. Thank you for the question. Um, I'm having a little difficulty breaking this question down. Does spirit override any of the needs to highlight purity of identity? Okay, so in the Japanese, when you talk about Japan, the pure Japanese, right? This idea of Damashi and everything. Uh, they have a pure, like the samurai are the one who historically have pretty much symbolized this, right? And they have a code Bushido. It gets very, very deep. So the purity of identity in Japan is to follow this code, right? So, for example, a lot of people think that Japan is Shinto or Buddhist, and they are, and it's true. But there's also a contingent of Christianity now. So, if you had to say what their religion is, what would it be? And I would say that it is their code, right? It is staying on code. They call it Wa, right? The harmony, keeping the harmony, and your ability to do that is first and foremost in Japanese society.
That is like, that makes so much sense to me. That's fascinating because, we always laugh kind of looking at Japanese folks in society, because it's like you're born Shinto, you live or you get married Christian or
Right.
whatever, and then you
Hmm.
die Buddhist.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so there's not really a flu usually, and not to say that there aren't families that don't have, they're not devout to Buddhism or Christianity, but it's religious spaces are almost looked at cultural, societal, not the same way we think about it in the US. And the other thing that I think about is, so I have tried to engage Shinto as a way to reconnect with historical Japan, and I was not able to do that culturally, right? Because I'm culturally not Japanese. I don't speak Japanese. I don't speak it well. And I've just been not been able to convince the Shinto priest in Hawaii, and there, we have several Shinto shrines, um, to teach me anything. And so that's fascinating when you say it's like, what makes somebody Japanese and what gives somebody a Japanese spirituality. Um, I would really argue, with Takuan brought up Bushido, the samurai, really being the image for most of the world, and perhaps Japan, definitely for Japanese Americans, of like carrying on this idea of what it means to be Japanese. um but I also want to just throw out there, a lot of people don't know the history of Ainu, and so I always argue that
Mm.
Japan is actually founded on anti-aboriginality, right? And so my DNA, my grandfather's DNA, goes back 75,000 years, connected to Australian Aboriginals. I
Mm.
come from, as an Ainu woman, I come from Aboriginal Japan. Uh, we called it Ainu Moshiri. That's what my ancestors called it.
Right.
And we come from Black Asia, right? Aboriginal Black Asia. And so I argue academically that Japan is really founded as a nation on anti-aboriginality and therefore anti-blackness. And so I really have a very hard time looking at historically some of the things that have gone on in media, in the
Mm.
way that Black people, Black features have been portrayed. And
Mm.
I don't like to separate, again, anti-Blackness and anti-Aboriginality, because I believe in the Japanese context, we're talking about intersections of the same philosophy. Um, and I think it's important, right? When you look at shogun, when you break down the Chinese characters, it actually means
Yeah.
barbarian hunter, barbarian referring to Aboriginal folks, right?
Right.
Aboriginal people. Um, so can you tell me a little bit about, like, I've been watching on the news that Japan has actually had a movement of Black Lives Matter. There's been a wonderful movement in Japan around this talk about diversity, and the importance of recognizing that Black folks are Japanese in Japan, right? And contributing to society and leaders in the society. But can you talk about there? I've also seen to this day very horrible images when it comes to Black features, and I'm just going to say Aboriginal features. What is happening now in Japan? What are some concerns? What are the conversations around that?
Okay. Thank you very much. You kind of went a few different places from history to shogun all the way up.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry,
um,
sorry about that. I can be all over. So
no,
rein me
that's
in.
fine. Okay, no problem. But going first on shogun, the yeah, as you said, I think I can't remember the exact words, but yeah, it was talking about that's why that position was formed, right? In order to kick out to expel the Ainu and the Emishi. This is part of the Yamato taking over, right? And and actually, I've read, I had a lot of research about this, and I get a lot of flack about this, but there's a lot of historians who say the person who was first given that was actually a black man. His name was Sakunoe Tamonomaro, and he has a shrine dedicated to him in Kyoto, um, the Kiyomizu-deru, which is my favorite temple. And I haven't been able to get anything in Japanese that will substantiate that, but I just have to put that out there. But
Interesting.
yeah, and so yeah, and it was about expelling them and getting them, out of that area. Especially where it starts in Kyoto and Nara, that's where like the birth of everything happens. As far as racism in Japan against black people, again, when you for black people coming over here, a lot of them will say no, there's none, because the police don't, because it's a comparison thing. They've been traumatized in the United States or in the continent of Africa or the Caribbean islands they come from, right? So comparably, there is no comparison, in a lot of ways. I think in Tokyo, I did an interview with a DJ. He talks about how much he gets stopped by police and harassed for, they'll say that they want to check his visa, but he's getting singled out because he's a dark skinned brother. And but it escalates all the way to we need to check you and pat you down and all this kind of stuff. So we did a interview about that. So it's back and forth. The thing we always have to remember is we live in this system of racism, white supremacy. So to think that you're going to go anywhere and escape that in the long run is not realistic. And I kind of thought that when I first came out. I'm embarrassed to say that now, and went through that. And no, it just has a different form, right? It has a different form. So yeah, it exists just like, the Japanese, they don't want to get real dark. The work girls want to stay out of the sun. What is the higasa, like the parasol that they walk around. Asian women in general are famous for that. So yeah, they definitely, have the same, it's the same thing all over the world. But as
Yes.
far again, but comparably, when you talk to Black people, most of them are going to say, no, it doesn't exist. Because also, if I can piggyback back to the Japanese complex, following all of that trauma that followed how America came, or the West came in after World War II, that's the reason that the complex happened. But the way that it manifests itself in society is what's really interesting, because the fact that they've actually set aside certain people, for example, to speak English, like just the same way the emperor set aside certain comfort women, right? Because they know what they did in other countries, and they're like, oh, these Americans, these guys ain't barbarian, we don't want them to get to the real Japanese, so we need to have a buffer, right? And they did that with people too. I mean, excuse me, with people to speak English, to be Western, like to engage with them. And so this is the thing. So you meet a lot of these people, and then they won't want to speak any Japanese with you. But I don't want to digress from that. But I wanted to say a lot of Black people, because they're coming from these Western places, and for the most part, they have college degrees, right? So they become a recipient of the Japanese complex, where they get kind of congenial treatment, because the more you come off as the children of the conquerors, the more there's just an innate, traumatized reaction to, oh, let me just calm down and
Right.
be, congenial.
Right. One of the reasons why I really wanted to expose our audience to your brilliance and the way that you've broken things down and how you teach
Thank you.
about this, there are several implications to me that really matter to me as somebody that's trying to be a decolonial, de-imperialized educator.
Mhm.
One obviously is that we cannot we cannot profess as Asian Americans, as Japanese Americans, um, as Japanese people to be allies to Black folks if we're not recognizing and talking honestly about the Yamato Code, the Japanese social code. That has to be acknowledged. Um, Also, though, on the flip side, I'm not going to make any excuses for colorism. I'm not going to make any excuses for prejudice and bigotry and hate. We're going to put that on the side. But the perception with the model that we know about of racism and classism in America, the perception is if uh, Mr. Amaru and I walked into a workspace, right? The perception is that he would be perceived as less Japanese than I from an
Mhm.
American model of oppression. And the reality is, I think within an hour, they would clearly see probably less than that, maybe 10 minutes. I
Mhm.
would then be I would be the outsider, right?
Right.
So it's very interesting how I think there's a lot of implications to your work for us to really think about and talk about. Um, let's talk about. Forgive me if I'm not saying this correctly.
No problem.
Ijima,
Uh,
Ijime,
Ijime.
Ijime,
Okay.
Ijime. So, and this is fascinating to me because a couple years back there was a big thing about Princess Aiko going to school and being bullied, and I'm thinking I never wanted to send my children, my brown babies, to a Japanese school because I knew the bullying would happen, right? Um, and so when I saw Princess Aiko going through this, I'm like, is anybody immune in Japan from the bullying?
Oh no.
So
No.
no,
Yeah.
that's just
No.
the
And
answer.
okay. Well. Yes and no. Again, this all drops back to the code again. And the whole idea of being group oriented. This is where they learn it, right? They learn it in school. It's schools, and I write in the book. that you can compare the school to a military school. If you're from a Western, like for example, they even have the kids march and they have a banner and everything that they do. They have inspections. It's like the military, and each classroom, unlike Western schools where you change classes, right? They don't change classes. They're with the same 30 to 40 people, and the fact that it's 30 to 40 people, right? They have to stay in there, and for 8 to 10 hours, the school day is longer than the West. It's just trying. It's to me, it is torturous, and it was for me when I worked in the schools. I worked in the school system for over 10 years, and it almost killed me. I had to get out of there. And so when you're in that kind of group, like for example, I still work in schools, but I only do it part-time, right? When I walk in the classroom, any classroom, when you walk in, you're the outsider, right? So everybody is looking at you and they're instantly on code, right? But because of the nature of what I'm teaching, something like test skills for TOEFL or something like that, I get them loosened up, because my goal when I first walk into a classroom is to find out who's the Ijiman, because it goes on in every social situation.
Wow.
And so who's the weakest person, who's the strongest student, and then I try to bring that strong student down a little bit and raise up that. Why? Because then it creates a safe environment. The students start seeing, wow, I can just relax in here because nothing's going to happen to me.
Right.
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 Hmm.
And so is that with educational spaces right now in Japan, is that kind of conversation happening about safety, or is it just pretty much accepted that the
Both.
ijime is going to happen? Both.
Both.
Yeah.
The PR is, yeah, oh, well, it was a problem. But if you look at every article about it, especially when it's a student in school and the mother is, the bereaved mother is speaking, it's almost like you could just, what they're going to, exactly what they're going to say. Why? Because of the code. They have to do what's expected of them, or then they'll be ousted. Just the fact that they're being singled out for something like this is bad. Like, I write in the book about that. Like, what is she going to say?
Yes.
I failed to teach them what to do. No, that's not going to happen. So she has to blame the school, right?
Right.
But I had a teacher tell me my first school back in 1998. Shout out to Hamamatsu. Um, and he told me, I don't know if he knew, he was like, no, this Ijime thing, he was like, no, this is who we are. He was like, he compared it to like green tea and stuff. Like, this is how traditional it is. Shout out
Wow.
Watanabe Sensei. He really, really put me, and he wasn't trying to speak any English or anything, and he was, oh, you Japanese? He was like, let me put you down. So you find that amongst Japanese too. And also, I want to say this before the racism thing. As you know, there's a difference between racism, bigotry, and like prejudice, right? A lot of people, we group them all together because there is a very there's a common denominator with them. But racism, when you look at it, it's systemic, right? It's a system. So really, a lot of times, I try to tell some of my white friends or associates, like a lot of times, no, you're a white supremacist by association just because of the benefits you receive for something you didn't do, right? You're not turning them down, you know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying you should, but I don't want to get too much on that. But as far as when you talk about prejudice, any person can be prejudiced, right? But the system, the code in Japan right now is not having that. So if you, as a Black person in Japan, if you feel like someone's being racist towards you, you need to use the code and make that known. Because if
Oh,
people
wow.
around, make that known to the other people in the group. But you have to do it in a way you can't you can't do it like that, And I have a break in the book when it happened to me a couple times. And I actually did another interview. For example, I worked at a school in Kyoto, and they had a bunkasai, was a cultural festival, and all the art students drew pictures, big mural, and they put it up in front of the school. It's huge. And on one of the pictures was a blackface, image. And I was like, I walked into school that day and saw that thing. I was like, wait, that's not what I saw. And I actually walked in and was like, no, I'm just tired. And backed up. Like, I didn't even want to turn around. I was like, let me just make act like this is the way I'm coming in, and looked up and seen this blackface image. A long story short, I told them, I was like, well, yeah, I can't work here, if you're gonna, this is what's going on. And at the time, I had no plan. I was like, oh man, but this is what I got to do. And they ended up taking it down. It cost them a great cost and everything. But the way I did it was, I went on and found information in Japanese that denounced blackface and showing images, and I printed copies and gave it to everybody in school. And because when I first tried to tell my supervisor, he was blowing me off, like, yeah, like, toughen up, like, and I was like, all right. And I said, I was like, okay, I'm just trying to tell you why I'm not going to be here tomorrow. And then that got his attention, and then I went home and did that and got it out. And once everyone in the school, now they all have a say in it. And that right now is not the code. Now, we know back before, like World War World War II and everything, when they were, doing the imperial thing, that was when it was on code. That was the code. So a lot of these, the behavior, the words, ainoko and all that stuff still persists from that. And I'm not saying that there are not individuals who do that, who are down with that. But even then, if inside the group, because they're not going to try to go against this group, you're not going to change people intrinsically. You know what I'm saying? But all I'm caring about but your behavior when I'm around, you know what I'm saying? That's all you can really hope. So you can have enough space to stand on your square and do what you came to do and express who you are, right?
So in a sense, would you then recommend you're almost using that system of shame and saving face to your advantage? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's exactly what you're hearing. Because the whole thing is, this system is thousands of years old. No one's going to change it. You're not going to change it. You know what I'm saying? So it's like knowing the rules of the game, right? So
Right.
you coming in, you have a blueprint. Okay, this is what's happening. Okay, I see it now, right? And then okay, now what do I do, right? And the whole thing, and again, I see a lot of foreigners who come in here, and they start thinking they got to do the shuck jive thing, and they're being extra. I'm not saying smiling is not great, because actually that's part of the code too, just being congenial. But it doesn't mean you got to be, doing a shuck and jive dance. You know what I mean? That doesn't, like, and that's another thing in Japan. Like, just straight up, I'm going to say it. Cooning doesn't work in Japan. Like, it will work with a certain couple individuals, right, who are really on the Western thing. They went and studied at Princeton or something like that. But
Fascinating.
yeah, it doesn't work. It doesn't give you, and actually it's just going to make people see you as a gaijin. That's all it's going to do. Because the clown thing, anything like that, goes into the gaijin box. You know what I'm saying? And the whole thing for me, especially, it started because of, like you said, I'm of Japanese descent. My mother's Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
But slowly it's evolved because, like, for example, a good friend of mine and business partner, Sterling Carroll, he to me, he's, so-called Black American 100%, but he's way more Japanese than I am in the context, because he came at such a young age, and he has friends from when he was young.
Mm-hmm.
And real friends, not the I have a foreigner friend,
Yeah.
like, and hey, let's
about
use
that.
ketchup. Let's use some ketchup today, and stuff like that. I don't mean
It's either
that.
ketchup, mayonnaise, or cheese, right?
Yeah, right. And when you come over, why do we always have this? What up with the miso soup, man? Can we? Because that becomes repetitive, and
Right.
that is all part of, and people don't realize, when you first come, that doesn't bother you, right? If you're in that first, especially 3-year period, yeah, because you're the center of attention, and you're like, it's kind of like rock star status, right? But you'll notice that you go to a different situation, and everybody won't even talk to you, right? Because it's not gaijin time. It's like time to play pin the tail on the on the gaijin. Then we're gonna come over. Hey, you know what I'm saying? And but you're not being taken seriously as a human being.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You're a caricature, like an anime or something, right?
Oh, thank you so much for acknowledging that. There is a huge wave of Hawaiians trying to work with Japanese to do hula dancing, right?
Yes, yeah,
And this
big. Hula dancing is big in Japan.
it's big, and it's hurtful to a section of the Hawaiian community, because these dances are religious, they're spiritual, they're cultural. Um, my experience has been, right, if Japanese nationals know that I'm Hawaiian, they will treat me a lot nicer. But then I kind of become like this thing, like you're saying, like you're almost dehumanized, but they're nice to you. They take care of you. They may throw money at you, but it's not. I know that it's not genuine. Where those that are kind of further away from the culture, they're like, "Oh God, this is the nicest people in the whole entire world." Um, Part of I've had problems with really accepting that kind of thing, because I've seen, like, you see with Chicana culture, Latin culture, you have subpopulations in Japan that really have absorbed it. And I think from the Western model,
Yes,
the
yes.
US model, it looks like cultural appropriation. You have that with hip hop and African American culture, where there are subpopulations in Japan that really go ahead and they absorb that, and they're tanning and they're perming their hair and all this kind of stuff. And to an extent, that's happening a lot with hula and Hawaiian culture. And I think a big concern of mine is when we start having the in Hawaiian, we say kumu hula. That is basically a sensei, and they call it hula sensei in Japan. Where is the line, and where is the protection when it comes to doing something because you admire it, and then erasing, feeling like you can do it as good or better than the originators, right? And then you end up erasing the cultural value to the actual people. Um, so, do you have any
Yeah.
comments on that?
Oh
Because
yeah, yeah.
that happens probably with a lot of different ethnicities in Japan. Where is that coming from?
Okay, well, yeah. I think it's two main things. Well, first of all, we live in a very downtrodden era. Like if we just look at humanity, just how everything is just really, really down. It's become mediocre and cookie cutter. So that is just the age we live in. You look at it from the Kabbalah side of it, whatever, however you want to look at it. From the Japanese side, if you look at the history of Japan, that's all Japan does, right? So a lot of times people got angry with me when I was like students. I had to tone it down a little bit when I was like, Japan's great, but what is Japan actually invented, like originated from the cool, you know what I'm saying? And they started saying stuff like, kimonos, like, nah, you can go Korean and China and find that older, and I was just trying to get them to see, no, Japan's specialty is that they actually take things and innovate them in a way, and well, both actually, they make them Japanese. If you look at like ramen noodles, and most of the actually, it's not even. I thought it was all of them, but even the shops, they always have it written in katakana, right? Because it's not originally Japanese, right? Um, Everything that they take, that's what they do. So
Hmm.
hula is no different. But if you go in and look at any of these things, like for example, I've never been. I had a student who was she actually is big on hula. I never went to any of her events, but I'm sure if you go in and see the way that they interact, it's no different from any other Japanese group except for then they just hula. Like
Right.
there was a break dance group, and I remember when break dancing was way late, they're 30 years late. But I was like, let me see these Japanese break dancers. And I was like, wow, they could do all the moves. And this is like
Yeah.
in the night, and like I mean, I was like, wow. But then so I went and saw them on YouTube, and they actually like it's like, yeah, they come meet, have a meeting, you know what I'm saying? And then they get on and start practicing. Like there's no energy, there's no spirit. The same like when I think about breakdance and everything. The spirit, the gritty, the city, subways, and back in the day, you gonna lay down, the police might come and it's like no, it's just like you eat some donuts and muffins, some coffee,
Right.
you know. Okay, I'm gonna work on my head spin today, and they have a helmet, and I'm like, okay, this was back in like the early
Right.
2000s when I was doing hip hop, and
Yeah.
I was like, okay, how do I, bring these two worlds together, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. it becomes problematic. We're having some comments right now. Allison says, "I'm enjoying this interview. Thank you for taking the time to participate with us, Allison."
Yeah, thank
Album
you,
R
Allison.
says, "Talking about the group thing for a foreigner, would it be better to be inside the group or outside the group?" And then Soulful Chicago Book Fair, along the lines of what we were just talking about, it acknowledges that um, she sh- they say we had a large influx of Japanese brothers and sisters embrace African culture in New York in
Yeah,
our dance community in the 90s,
yeah.
and goes on to say, "I was going to ask if you see any semblance of that today in Japan. My peers used to even travel to Japan to teach house dancing."
Oh,
So I just kind of want to say, yes, there I have met Japanese folks from Japan, Japanese nationals that really have the best intentions of engaging with things outside of their own cultural frame. It's very problematic when we're talking about things like hula that are indigenous, things like hip hop, which comes from a frame of resistance that culturally they don't know anything about.
right.
It feels problematic to me. It also feels problematic like when you have people imitating the lowrider culture
Oh man.
and
Mhm.
Chicano culture, and they just don't have the history of the struggle. But I just want to acknowledge, we can't you know make a solution for that today, Takuan and I. But I just want
Yeah,
to acknowledge that's a big contention even going on between Japanese national and Japanese American communities, because Japanese American communities are now saying, like, let's talk about cultural appropriation. Let's talk about white folks putting chopsticks in their hair and not acknowledging the history of incarceration camps and things like that. And whereas Japanese folks are saying, go ahead, wear the kimono. Go ahead, eat with chopsticks, right? And Japanese Americans are saying, but my grandparents were incarcerated for doing this. So if you're going to do this, do it with some respect. And so there's a big gap I just want to
wow.
acknowledge that. There's a big
Yeah,
gap in the way both communities see this, even though our DNA is the same. Right.
right.
So, and it can get even further, it can get even more complex when we're talking about Japanese folks going into things that are then African American or doing house dancing or anything like that. Like I just want to acknowledge that up front.
And yeah, just to say, to go on what you said, again, remember the group orientation of Japanese, which that they learn in school, even inside the school, the the universe exists in that homeroom only. So people in the next classroom are insignificant to them. Like that's the thing you have to understand. So when you think about
Wow.
a culture that's outside of the country, like they're not trying to be rude or really big you up. They like you don't really exist. You're
Right.
just something that we draw get ideas from to bring into our universe, right?
Right.
Yeah, so you can look at it a number of different ways, but if you ask a Japanese person who's in Japan, an everyday Japanese person, they would have such difficulty trying to answer you because they'd have to even just wrap their mind around what you're talking about because they're like, no, you don't understand. I'm traumatized in my group. Japanese are famous for working overtime, right? If you're in the group, especially like a big company or something, they take up all of your time plus. You know what I'm saying? Like these
Fascinating.
pictures, they're
Yeah.
sleeping in the subway, especially if you're young, when they're really, really trying to break you in. And yeah, they're not thinking about anything outside of what they have to think about because they already have too much to think about. And
So
this is by design.
it's by design. It's
Right.
systemic, and that's just that. Thank you. And ancestral connections. What we're found. Really, we're founded wanting to produce anti-racist, decolonial, de-imperial curriculum and education, and these activities that can help those of Japanese heritage,
Hmm.
be more reflective and be able to engage with these concepts. And even I, right, as an educator, don't realize just the vast difference in the cultural frames and societal frames that we're dealing with
Right.
to even have these conversations. So, Takuan, I have to thank you because it's very enlightening for me. Um, we're gonna be wrapping up the conversation soon. So if you
Okay.
have a question for Takuan, please go ahead and put it in the box. Soulful Chicago Book Fair just said, I see that for sure. The lack of connection to the actual culture of our dance. I used to get videotaped even. Yeah, yeah. And so that's, I think, my concern for hula is this idea that if you purchase it, like if you purchase a hula lesson, you own hula, you own an indigenous practice, which in many
Yeah.
ways, this is a heritage. So the because because there is such lack of conversation around aboriginality and indigeneity, indigenous people in Japan outside of tourism, I then want to do this kind of education and complicated conversations so that Japanese people can engage with other parts of the Pacific in what I feel would be a more respectful, more appropriate way.
Yeah. Hmm.
But it's also important for us to look at the bigger picture, right? How we as East Asians in America, we're benefiting from, as somebody that is very, white presenting myself, benefiting from white supremacy, like Taquan was talking about earlier, and that we have these very complex, we these are nuances and these are very different frames from Japan to different parts of Asia to different parts of the Pacific to Hawaii to the continental U.S. that unless we have these conversations with somebody like
Right.
Taquan who has this multicultural lens, who's going to point that out, right? um,
Right.
and I've actually looked into some of the sources that Taquan uses, as a scholar, and they're root sources, but they can't make these connections that somebody like Taquan makes because just being a multicultural person. So I really want to express to you, Taquan, how grateful I am, and these conversations are enlightening for me as an educator, and they're healing for me as a Japanese person that has struggled with this. Like, that
Right.
question, is it better to be insider or outsider? My whole life, my struggle, and I think to the detriment of my mental well-being sometimes, was like, why can't I be, why am I not an insider? Yeah. And Taquan has actually kind of taught me, correct me if I'm wrong, Taquan, but to use being an outsider a little bit more to my advantage
Yeah.
in
And
terms of the
yeah.
social code.
Yeah, and I think that question kind of alluded to that. As a foreigner, when you come over here, is it better to be inside or outside? You have an option. Now, if you're only here for a short time, you're going to be outside no matter what you do, right? So you don't have a choice. You might as well just live it up on the outside. But if you're going to stay here, if you want to live here, especially if you're going to plant seeds and have children, you have to be you have to understand how the way you're looked at is the way the child's going to be looked at. So if they see you as some goofy foreigner, that's going to go down to the child, and the child's not going to respect you. I've had some mental consultations about this, mental health consultations with people about just this, and it's like, yo, you don't get it. Like, you have to adhere to the code and do some things to get respect within the society. It's just like if your father drove around in a beat up car and you don't think the kids are going to get teased for that. Yeah, that's your pop over there fixing the flat tire. That's just how it goes. That's not, something that only happens in Japan.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you have to choose. And then if you choose to be in the group, though, don't think it's just a decision. Like, it's not, we're not, you have to put in the work, and then you have to still stand on your square because you don't want to lose yourself in doing that.
Right.
Right.
And that's that
And
big thing, right? How do we engage with the whole and not lose ourselves?
yeah.
Um, I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to read the most important
Okay.
question coming up is, they want to know, Taquan, have you thought about writing any more books? But before we get that, I'm going to come back to that. Something just came to mind. So I'm born and raised in Hawaii, where there's a week out of the year called Golden Week or something like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. It's coming up. Yeah.
where we have this influx of Japanese tourists. And it almost seems like during Golden Week, what
Hmm.
happens in Hawaii stays in Hawaii. There are things they do here that they would
Hmm.
never do back home.
Right.
And it's like they're breaking loose. Can you talk? What is that about?
Okay, well, Golden Week is coming up. It starts at the end of April and extends throughout the first week. So a lot of good companies, they might even get 2 weeks off. Um, and yeah, so there's a couple different holidays on there. One, Kodomonohi, which is the boys' holiday, and I can't even remember them right now, but there's 3 holidays in there. And yeah, so everybody goes away. Like I said, everything is on code, right? There's 3 times: end of the year, Shogatsu, right? New Year's. And then there's Golden Week, which is in April, May, beginning of May, and then there's Obon, right? That's the revering the ancestors in August. And those 3 times, everybody, it's just crazy, and everything, prices are high. But as far as what you said about they go crazy and do things that they normally wouldn't do, yeah, because see, they start. I'm out of like they I'm out of the restraints. These people don't matter. I'm outside, right? So they like I know people, some dudes that same thing. They would go over when they're in the States, and then they want to, yo, can you get some smoke? Can you what are you talking about? And it's like, but they won't do they won't think about that in Japan, even if it's offered to them. They're just like, no, 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 because they just can't switch. So the
Yeah.
same thing, they leave, and then they want to, yeah, they want to get crazy. Everything stays out there.
That's
You know,
that's their
Mhm.
that's their chance. But that's part of the system of
Right,
the code, right? The social code. So it's
right,
very rigid, and you have these certain times of the year where it's just acknowledged people are going to break loose and then
right,
return to the code.
right, and return and act like nothing happened. And even they have there's like,
Fascinating.
but even on like during the year, there's different. They call them enkais, where they're like banquets and they eat dinner and they get drunk. And I've heard now it's really toning down, and that scares me in a way because I'm like, so how are they getting this release? Because on some of these enkais, like when I was a teacher, working in a school, they would just let loose, like you like. I never would have thought. And I mean, you guys falling, being unconscious outside. One teacher, I went outside just to use the phone and he's laid out in the winter.
Yeah.
I was like, man, if I wouldn't have come out here, man, you might have died. Like, you know what I'm saying? The next day, like, I'm like, okay, okay, okay. I need to be a little, observant when I come to these and not get too relaxed myself, you know. But
Yeah, and I've wondered about that as well, because very close to where the center of Japanese tourism is in Hawaii, Waikiki, right around there, there's a lot of gentlemen's clubs, and it seems to cater towards Japanese businessmen, and
mhm,
this is a place where Japanese businessmen do business.
right.
So it seems to almost be very socially acceptable to do business meetings while drinking, not necessarily on the job, but there's an extension
Oh
where
no,
that
no, that yes.
happens.
Oh, that's like like
And then
I guess
apparently women. So
yeah, that's like in the West, playing golf. It's kind of it's kind of like that. Like that could be the deal breaker. If you're gonna go drinking with them, you got to go. You definitely got to go drinking. Alcohol is a must. And then yeah, just going and looking at girls and going to these usually it's hostess clubs,
yes.
right, where the
Hmm.
women pour you drinks and stuff like that. They're not really big on the like in America, the whole dancing and the poles and all that stuff. That doesn't, again, that's not the Japanese aesthetic. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, they want the woman to pour drinks and have conversation and this kind of thing. But
So
yeah.
what happens if you're off code? So if you just you're off code as a kid in school or as an adult, like what is to be expected?
Oh, okay. If you're off code, everybody in the group takes it upon themselves to put you on code, to hammer that nail down. And it's very subtle. Like that's what I'm trying to say. Like it's because everybody, they expect everybody to chip in. So you can't really lash out at any one person. And if you do, then you're really off code, like because you're not reserved now, like being
Mhm.
non-reserved. So that's the whole thing. They just keep on prodding you and prodding you. Like I had a kid when I even taught in Yochien or like preschools in kindergartens, and there was this one boy named Kentaro, and he wouldn't do anything. He would just be running around the whole time I was there, and the little nuns, the Japanese nuns, would be chasing him, Kentaro-kun, Kentaro-kun, everywhere. And you know, a couple years later, I happened to teach a shogakuse, a elementary school class, and there was a boy in there, and he was sitting in front of me. And when the whole class, and when it ended, he was real quiet. He just was still sitting there, and he was like, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I'm like, "Nah." I'm looking at Kentaro, and I'm like, "Kentaro, you're Kentaro-kun?" Like, this boy was so energetic and running around and wouldn't listen to anybody. He wouldn't stay in the class. I had to I had to administer some tough love. That's why he remembered me. And I was looking at him like, wow. And all I could think about, what did they do to you? You're 3 years later, and you are a completely different person. And nobody hit you. I'm pretty sure nobody hit you. They have the other, it's like the difference between the Asian water torture, where the water's, and putting you in a wet, beating you is, which one is more torturous? That's arguable.
Yeah.
But yeah, they break that spirit down.
Yeah.
It's like the military when you go into basic training. They break that everybody. Yeah, I'm cool. You like this,
Right.
And
Right.
yeah.
Is there are you aware of a particular age? I remember one time somebody telling me it was around 6. Like, children are allowed to run around and be free up until a particular age, and bomb, it stops. Are you aware of that?
I don't think it's a particular age. It's a particular, like, I'm gonna say that word, Ida, a period.
It's a
So like I
period.
said, so for Kentaro, he was a little bit later, but he wasn't late in the grand scheme of things. Right. They're like, there's just, they adjust for, some kids get it right away. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I've been to kindergartens where the students are all sitting, the proper way with their feet seiza, with their feet tucked under, and they're sitting there for like 40 minutes at like 5.
Not easy.
Yeah, but I know this teacher.
Yeah.
I know this lady. She used to hit the kids. She would hit them. So and I'm sure the parents knew this because she wasn't shy about it. I saw her. She mashed a couple kids right in front of me.
Wow.
But I like I said, that was the one class I never had to discipline anybody. Because they have, lo and behold, don't let me tell her, yeah, this guy had something, you know what I'm saying? He knows, you know what I'm saying? I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying, the different scenarios that I saw,
Yes.
I've experienced,
Yes, totally. Well, my goodness, Mr. Amaru has a wealth of experience, and the question coming up is, Takuan, have you thought about writing any more books?
Of course, that's what I do. And thank you for that question. There are people who, who are very intelligent and are very, have the gift of gab, and they write a book or a couple books. But then there's a difference between that and what I'm aspiring to be an actual writer, right? So I'm hoping that my work is going to continue to, improve and expand. So yes, right now I'm actually caught up in finishing a textbook. I'm making a conversation text, people who want to learn conversation, but about kind of abstract ideas. And of course, I'm always going to put the Afro-Asiatic thing in there. So some of the stories that I put in there are based on, showing some of the things that are going on in the world and society. But as soon as I finish that, I'm going to start my next book. What that's going to be, I am not at all. I have no idea right now, but I'm very excited because this is the first time I feel like totally free to write whatever I want. Because the first 2 books, Gaikokujin, which is a story I knew had to be written, and really, I wrote about things that happened when I was in the Army. When I was in the Army, like, it was like a series of miracles, just to say, because I went in I was from the street. I thought I was tough, all that thing. And oh man, and
Were
I
you in
should
the
have
Army, the U.S. Army or the Japanese
the
Army?
U.S. Army, right? And just like I said, without ruining anything, but I went in with this street thinking I'm tough mentality. I should have been kicked out. Like, one guy I know, I still talk to him. He said, "Yeah, when I first saw you," he said, "Oh, this guy's going to be gone in a week." And because, I just had it all wrong. And but not only did I not get kicked out, not only did I not get arrested or anything like that, I became like, even in basic training, I became like the number one soldier. And it wasn't because I was so good. That's the whole thing. At the time, if you let me tell it at 8, yeah, man, I'm near that, but when I had to go back and read it, you realize it's a series of things that just happened that fell into place. But I really believe it happened because of my level of sincerity and whatever the grand scheme is with the spirit. Like I was like almost used for certain things to occur, and these series of miracles occurred. Now, when I wrote that, my editor, he was like, "Yeah, I get it." He said, "But you can't start from the army. You have to tell them how you grew up." And that, like you said, that was embarrassing for me. I didn't want to do that, and I fought him on that. And he was like, "No one's going to understand it, man." And he finally got me to do it, and that was one of the most. That was very painful. So I actually wrote 2, 3, then 1, right? So yeah, I didn't. It was very, very painful to write that. But Japan Decoded, 21st Century Japan Decoded, that's nonfiction based on emails that I got from people. So this had to kind of be written. So these are kind of like, I guess you would say, like, this really tells you about me, you know,
Yes.
um, as a
And somebody
person.
somebody here is actually asking to talk soon because they have a matter that they would like a consult about. So I hope you read the book, because the book is very, very good. Breaks down all of these different scenarios
Mhm.
about, I'm learning this, Ijime.
Yeah,
I'm also
Ijime.
gonna get I'm gonna get your book about conversation as well. And this idea of uchi soto, insider, outsider. And he uses real scenarios from his life and from his work life. Very valuable. And like I said, for myself, I really wanted to introduce this to our audience for Ancestral Connections, because
Right.
it was healing for me. I began to stop engaging in Japanese spaces in such a combative way, and understanding that there, like Takuan had said, centuries old social code in place that I was just not going to change.
Right.
But what I could do, I could change my perception of what was going on, and I
Right.
could be more fluid around that. And I dare say, and Mr. Amaru has given us some nuggets today about, if we are dealing with egregious things such as racism or other things going on, we can use the social code to our advantage.
Right.
And
And
for me,
again,
that's, yeah.
right. I'm saying
So
no,
go ahead.
without doing that, without compromising who you are as a person. That's the main thing. And again, there's going to have to be some sort of compromise, but it can't be with who you are, because at the end of the day, that's all you have. Right.
Yeah.
So, you might have to adjust some things, and you might find out some things about you that need adjustment in that, because it's really about bringing down your pride. Because one of the biggest things, and when any Japanese person is coming at you, normally they're going to be suffering from being too prideful. And believe you me, if that's the case, the other Japanese know this about this person, right? But they haven't stepped over the line enough where, what I'm saying? So in many cases, you might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that's what happened to me in a number of cases. It's like, I come in and, I'm going to stand on something, and the person just didn't count on that because of whoever they had encountered in the past, or whatever they heard in the past about who they perceive me to be.
Oh my goodness. I feel like you're right
I
here
see. Is
in.
she with us? Okay.
Oh,
Well, I'm just going to continue.
are you
Um,
able to
yeah, but
see? Are
just
we
being able to understand that, again, it's more than just being able to point out something is wrong, but it's also the way you do it and who you do it.
Oh, I think I've been experiencing some lag. Can you folks see and hear me? If we could just put a yes or no in the chat. Okay. So our production side is saying that uh you folks can see and hear me. I'm hoping Taquan will be able to log back on really quickly. It might be that Mr. Amaru's internet went out. We are doing this from very opposite sides of the Pacific. I am located in Hawaii. Takuan Amaru is in Japan. We're back. So sorry, Takuan, can you hear?
Yep, back. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Sorry, your internet cut out. So did you wanna wrap up that thought?
Okay, I'm not sure where it cut off at. Yeah, I kind of maybe lost my thought, my pattern there. Do you remember where I was?
Yeah, we were talking about, like, how we use the social code to
Mm,
our advantage.
oh, okay. Yeah. Being able to, again, that's what I talk about, standing on your square, right? You don't compromise who you are when somebody comes against you and just like always get in this cower down mode, because
Yes.
that's kind of, if you see a lot of Japanese walking with their heads down or their, because think about that height. And I'm not saying you don't do that, right? For example, when I give the scenario about being stopped by the police, I think that sums it up, because being on code or not being on code is going to really dictate what happens or the way it happens. Again, there's no you're not going to get beat up, you're not going to get shot or anything like that if you ain't attacking them. You know what I'm saying? But the way they perceive you, even if they might even have some preconceived idea about black people, this is where, again, but if once you're stopped by the police, it's a break in the wall, and any kind of interruption gets this unwarranted attention. So police also know that. So this is the same thing. If some kind of incident happens at your school or job where somebody's coming against you and you make a complaint, everybody's going to look, and so who's on code? Who's on code? That's all they want to know, right? And if you're the foreigner, all eyes are going to come to you because they're going to naturally assume it's you, right? So that works to your detriment. But if you know the information, it actually helps you because you're on stage. The other person doesn't get to say anything. So if you
Yes.
demonstrate that you're on code, and they subconsciously, it makes them think, oh, he must, oh, okay, he's not lying, or he's not, and you could be, you know what I'm saying? But if you know, like for example, police, no matter what you might think in front of people, you kind of bow, and whatever he says, you're attentive, and you look humble. That doesn't matter what you think about that personal Japanese person, but you have to see them as an arm of the society. So by
Mm.
giving that person respect, it shows you're respecting everybody. That's in the Japanese mindset. Doesn't matter what you think. You know what I'm saying? And right there, that's going to already, okay, well, whoa, let me see what he has to say, right? And then the way you speak. Now, you could be speaking facts, but if you're kicking a lot of slang and you're doing a lot of movement and stuff like that, that's not going to come across right. It's kind of the same thing when you go to court. That's why you wear a suit and tie, right? I'm really a rocker, but you're not going to wear your heavy metal stuff to court if you're trying to win. If
Right.
you have a decent lawyer, you're not going to walk in with him,
Right.
or her. So it's the same. It's the same thing. This is kind of, and especially if you don't look Japanese, but you don't have any of the, for example, like if you have tattoos on your neck or on your face, or you just have too much jewelry, or especially earrings or stuff like that, that could make them see you, in a certain way. But if you don't have,
Yes.
yeah, you don't have all of that stuff, or even just too much of it, they'll give you a
Mm-hmm.
leeway. Now, if you're like, looking, not trying to pretend you're Japanese, that's not what it is. But it's just like you're showing humility. You're being attentive. You're doing these things that the code dictates. Everybody's going to notice it, and
Yes.
it makes the police officer have to also do it. So again, in your school too, if you make some kind of complaint or whatever, and it gets to be an incident, the way you voice it, the way you come, is going to dictate, not suggest, how this person has to come back at you. Because especially once it becomes something that's in front of the group, now it's like court. You're in court now, and you have to address the court. and there's no limit to how tedious this can become, but this thing, when something comes, you have to be ready to be tedious, and you can't ever look like, oh, if you do that, you're done. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying?
Yeah.
You know?
And you bring up the tattoo thing, and so for me, as Aboriginal Ainu woman, that is something that I would like to do, because historically we've had face tattoos. Historically we've had
Hmm.
hand tattoos. This is all a
Hmm.
part of the Germanic culture that Japan had as a nation has risen from, and that's something that for myself I would like to go back to. But because I've had the privilege of getting to know Takuan, and Takuan advising me kind of throughout the years, I know tactfully how I will then engage with Japanese society about that. And I don't lie
Hmm.
to myself about how that's going to be perceived by
Right.
Japanese society. We have a comment here that actually says when you cut out, his vibration was too strong for the connection, which I agree. It's like, speak that wisdom. Um, and I think that it's important for many different people, but especially anybody that's planning to work in Japanese society, and I would dare say even a place like Hawaii where there's a lot of Japanese people.
Hmm.
But even as you were talking, our production crew in the background is probably laughing as well, because you sound as if you know about Japanese American politics. Because what tends to happen is with Japanese American cultural organizations and things like that, there's always, when there's a fallout, one person will step forward, and sometimes that's me. And then I get people coming to me to the side saying, "Oh, I'm so glad you did this." And so it was almost like the group thing. They could see
Yeah.
that that person was not correct, but
Hmm.
nobody wanted to be the nail stepping forward to saying it, because they didn't want to deal with the pounding down,
Right.
right? And so nobody would stand up, say in my case, publicly while I was
Hmm.
getting that pounded down, but in the back end they were giving me support. And
Right.
eventually things changed in a quiet way. And
Hmm.
so yeah, and so your book and everything that you talk about helps me to understand this as a system. Not that there's anything wrong with me, right?
Right.
For years growing up, I
Hmm.
thought that there was something wrong with me because I was not pure, right? And that was something that I had internalized. So you changed that narrative for me. I'm sure you're doing that for a lot of other people as well. Is
Hopefully.
Where can folks get in contact with you if they want you to speak, or they want to ask you questions? What are your social media handles?
Oh, yeah, I'm easy to reach. As you can see on the screen right now, that's my website, takuanamaru.com. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, and yeah, I think that's the best place you can to get me, or even Takuan Amaru at Gmail, takuanamaru@gmail.com.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Taquan. Is there any last words that you want to share with the audience?
Only one thing I remember you said earlier about when you talked about the hula and the education. I think it's very, very important, and I say this in the book, for especially Black people, when you come over here, I try to engage people and say things to them that they normally wouldn't hear, right? I don't try to, I'm not talking about capping or, exaggerating stuff like that. But I mean, I know because I've been here for a while, I know where their boundary, where it stops, and just say something that they're not going to be familiar with, because you might be the only Black person that they really get to engage to in their entire life, especially if they're young and they haven't entered into society. That's what they call it, going out into society, right? And that's when they really get the lockdown. So yeah, and that it could really, really change someone's thinking because they're still in the formative stages, so to speak. So yeah, I think that's the key. I can break dancing and the culture. Just when I told them even about like how it used to be illegal, and how we would get arrested, what I'm saying, for doing that, because we are fighting, you're fighting, we're fighting with cardboard, like what are you talking about, like, and so yeah, when they start learning and they start putting the dots together, again, it's in this situation, it leads to respect and understanding culture. But that's not what my hope for it is. Really just to get the wheels turning, because if they do it in this, they can do it in their own lives, because again, I'm all about mental health. And if you think, again, the mental health situation here is very, very, stormy. A lot of great things about Japan. But the book, of course, it's a critical book. So I'm talking about, some of the things that don't get highlighted normally in detail.
And thank you so much. And I just want to say there is no better person to be building these bridges and making these connections and talking about these important pieces. And I'm hearing you talk about two very important things. One is the mental health of Japanese folks, and how if foreigners come in with understanding the code, how they could possibly even make a difference. And helping to broaden the lens and the perspective of Japanese people in a more healthier and robust way. And the flip side of that is also for um, the melanated blessed folks in Japan,
Hmm.
those that are not pure Japanese, how we can come into Japanese spaces or even diasporic Japanese spaces and not compromise or not feel like we're compromising who it is that we are.
Right. Don't
um,
have to.
and go ahead and understand the system of the social code and use that to our advantage and be okay, as know that we are walking away whole as people.
There it is, as whole, working as whole, not hafu, not half,
Right.
right? Yeah, right. Yep. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Hayashi, and everybody at the Ancestral Connections for having me here. This has been a great talk. Yeah, please, folks, get at me. Support the book, 21st Century Japan Decoded. Get it on Amazon, and also we got some comments from the Soulful Chicago Book Fair. I actually have a booth set up there. So if you're into the virtual thing, it's a virtual world, and there's a lot I'm going to present on April 9th, I think, over there. But there's a lot of really, really good presenters that are going down. So yeah, if you want
Oh,
to get
terrific.
on that. Yeah.
Please send me the links to that. If there's anything you guys are doing
Yep. I'll
virtually, I
send the
would
link.
love to share it with our
She might
audience in
she might
Hawaii.
put it
Yeah,
up.
I would love to do that.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
Thank you so much for your time
Thank you
today.
very much.
And I'm looking forward to your next book. And if you have not bought his books already, go out and do that. It will completely change your perspective. So
Thank you very
mahalo
much.
nui. Thank you so much.
ありがとうございました。Okay.